at the Belknap Mill. This year, we're sharing French-Canadian recipes to go along with an exhibit we have planned in September. On the last episode, we had Rosemary Robichaud, and today I'm happy to say that we have Father Marc from the St. Andre Bassette Parish in Laconia, New Hampshire.
Hi, as Kathy just shared with you, my name is Father Marc. It's a pleasure to be here with you as I share with you my family recipe that I received from my father for our French-Canadian pork pies. And perhaps just a bit of history about the French-Canadian pork pie. The origin of this perhaps goes back to the 5th century in France, where they would prepare a pie, what was known as la patina, which was perhaps named that way because of the copper pot that it was cooked in. And it was a variety of meats that they would put in chunk meats with spices and cover it with a pastry of some type, perhaps braise it with wine, and they would serve that for a meal. And of course, they would have a variety of large chunks of meat. It could be venison, it could be pork, it could be anything they had available. So they would make that to celebrate. When the Canadians came to Canada, or I should say when the French came to Canada, what they did was they carried on that tradition and they tied it in because it was related in a very profound way to the celebration of Christmas. And every Christmas after the midnight mass, the Canadians would get together and have what's known as a réveillon, which it means an awakening, and they would celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ. And in that, what they would do is they would normally gather in their villages and they would have these large feasts that would incorporate obviously the Canadian pork pie, but also they would have fish and pastries and sweetbreads, and they would celebrate, and they would go well into the morning hours celebrating the birth of Jesus Christ. Well, as a result of that, this Canadian tradition started, and depending upon the region of the Quebec province where you live, the pork pie began to take on a variety of variations. So if you're the northern part, it might happen to have more game meat, bear, venison, perhaps anything else, rabbit, etc. And they would chop it up in large chunks and they would serve it in a pot, which was known as un tourtière. And so with that, if you're more in the Quebec province, down perhaps maybe in the Montreal, Quebec City area itself, they were using more a version of ground meat, perhaps venison, pork, or beef. And then if you were over closer to the maritime provinces, they might be using a meat pie, as I just explained to you, but they would also perhaps using more likely a fish pie that either had cod or salmon and potato in it, and a variety of spices as well. We know that here, many French Canadians here in the Laconia area know it as un tato salmon, salmon pie. And that was commonly had during the season of Lent, but in Canada, they would celebrate Christmas with that particular pie during the year. The tourtière, which as I mentioned is the pot, and it's a pot similar to this right over here, perhaps more of a ceramic pot. This is a Le Creuset, which is fabulous to cook in. If you don't have one, I strongly advise you to get one. Please send me a sponsorship, Le Creuset. But anyways, I strongly encourage you to get one. But the tourtière was perhaps maybe known perhaps for a type of bird, a carrier pigeon. And with that, the tourte, T-O-U-R-T-E, was the name of that particular carrier pigeon, which years ago in France, they would use to actually make the pork pie or the meat pie. So the origin of the name tourtière, not too sure. It certainly is the name of the pot, but it also could be the name of the pot could come from the derivation or the use of the word tourte, which was the name of the carrier pigeon which they used in making the pies originally back in France. So today we're going to sit there and make the French-Canadian pies. I know it. When I was growing up, we had the celebration of Réveillon in my family home here on Cherry Street in Laconia, where we would all go to midnight mass, my immediate family. Then afterwards, my grandmother and my uncle would come over and we would have the Réveillon. We'd celebrate having breakfast with Canadian pork pie, as well as some breads. We always had sweet pickles that accompanied it, and coffee, and then from there we'd open our Christmas presents and go to bed around 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning. So as kids, it was a long night, but it was a fun night. And as I get older in age, I've certainly come to appreciate the heritage that I received in this tradition of making pork pies. Now, I guess how I came to make the pork pies was kind of interesting. When I became pastor of Laconia back in 2009, several people had approached me and they said, "You have to make pork pies for the fair." And I went, well, I know how to make pork pies. How many do you make? And she said, oh, about 450. Well, my family recipe was actually about 7. And so I went, how do I have to do this for 450 pies? So thank God for the gift of the calculator. I was able to sit there and calculate out all the pounds of onions, the potatoes, the meat, how much dough we needed, etc., how many spices mixtures we needed, etc. And as a result of that, we now have what I call a machine that rolls out close to 400 pork pies every year for our Christmas fair. So what we're going to do for you today is I was fortunate to get some lean ground pork locally here, and we've used lean ground pork. Now, what I will say about the pork Canadian meat pies, everybody's family is the best recipe that exists because we were raised with it. And the recipe itself, there could be a variety of variations of it. So when I was growing up, originally we used half beef, half pork. And as we got older, we found that sometimes the indigestion factor was a little too much with both meats combined. And we went with lean ground pork, which provided a little more easier digestive system experience. So that being the case, we're using lean ground pork today. And so what I've done first is I've put a little water in the bottom of the pan. Some of the recipes call to brown the meat without any water and add water later. What I found with cooking with pork is if you burn it in the browning stage, you have to throw it out because there's no redemption from burnt pork, or actually any meat that's burnt. So you want to sit there and use some lean ground pork. Clean hands are always an important aspect of cooking. And you're just going to kind of sit there and break it, put it into the water, which we're going to turn up on high because you want the water to start boiling. So I'm going to sit there and kind of break up the pork, because you want it to be ground. It is ground, but you want it a crumbling mixture. And you want to begin to be able to cook it in the water. And you need to keep an eye on it. Perhaps I think this is the most important stage because you don't want to sit there again, as I said, to burn it. I have 3 pounds of ground pork here. Normally, the recipe would call for 7. I cut it in half for today's cooking adventure, as I'm calling it. All right, it's always important to layer flavors when you're cooking. So I'm going to add a little salt right now. Salt kind of brings out and enhances the flavor of the meat to start before I sit there and add any of the other spices. Okay, so we're going to let this kind of sit for a moment. Here, it takes a while for the pot to get hot because it's cast iron. It's on high. When we do our Canadian pork pies at the parish fair, it's kind of interesting. We do a day of preparation before. So originally, the first year, a couple of years I was here, we literally peeled, I don't know how many hundreds of pounds of potatoes and how many hundreds of pounds of onions. And after a while, I said, this is ridiculous. There's got to be an easier way. So in speaking with Hector's restaurant locally, they said, oh, sure, you can buy, cubed potatoes from us, and you can buy diced onion. And I went, sold. We're buying them because it's so much easier to make. And I've come to find that when you're sitting there and cooking, sometimes the easiest way is the fastest way, and it's also the best way as far as food preparation goes. So we started using that we get in early in the morning. We're all set up. We have about 17 electric roasters. And then the day before, we've made all the dough that we need to use. It's rolled in balls, so there's about 10 pies per ball of dough. And we have set up rolling stations in our parish hall. And then we arrive in the kitchen at 5 a.m. in the morning the day we're making the pies. And we start going through the whole process of adding the meat to all the roasters. And then from there, we begin to season it. We add the onion. And then as it's cooking, then eventually, as this is getting to a certain point, then from there we add the potato and let that simmer in. And potato is interesting. Again, some people, every recipe is slightly different. So some people will use cubed potato, as I do in my family recipe. Others will use mashed potatoes. And so whatever works, works. It's your family recipe. There's nothing wrong with it. Just enjoy the recipe and the heritage that comes with it. One of the things I like about the cooking, and especially in a heritage type way such as this, is the aspect of what I call the sacramentality of cooking family recipes, because the beautiful thing about family recipes is they connect us with the past. And so when I think back, as I shared with you, the family stories I had of celebrating Christmas Eve with my mom and dad, my siblings, and then with my grandmother and my uncle, and perhaps maybe a couple of other uncles that would come over, it certainly brings me back to the past. So it connects me, it roots you in who you are and what you're about. But then those experiences kind of bring you into the present, and they also push you into the future because you have a greater understanding of who you are as you move forward in life. So I've always enjoyed the aspect of cooking for that reason, especially family recipes. Okay, so you can see the meat has come to a boil now, and you need to have it come to a boil. Again, you're cooking the pork. You don't want to have any red juices left, so you can see that it's got a nice beige consistency. And so we're going to add the spices. Now, everyone's spice mixture is basically a little different. It's all family recipe. For us over here, obviously we have salt. We use ground black pepper, garlic salt, accent as a flavor enhancer, and then we use cinnamon, clove, and allspice. And so those are the primary mixtures here. My recipe would be normally for 7 pounds of meat. I have 3. So what I'm using is a half teaspoon of each, equal proportions, in addition to the additional salt. So I'm just gonna layer that in. And what's really nice about this is it really takes on, the meat takes on the flavor very quickly. I'm going to let that simmer in there, kind of bring that up. And while that's cooking, I've taken 1 onion diced for, again, 3 pounds of meat. Normally for 7 pounds of meat, it would be 2 onions diced. To bring that in there to add the flavor. Just kind of stir that in and just kind of let it cook a little bit. Okay, we're going to bring this up to a boil, and you really want to let it come to a boil because you have to let things cook. I mean, that's the whole aspect of cooking. Cooking sometimes takes time. Now, what I always do to kind of help myself along a little bit is when I'm mixing up, I found the easiest way to make this is to pre-mix the spices in advance. Not just taking them out of the jar as you need them, to put them in a bowl, mix the mixture up completely. That way you're getting an even mixture and it's going in and just sprinkle it around. In addition to that, afterwards, I make another mixture proportion, and if I need to add additional flavor as I'm going along, once this is cooked a while, I'll taste it and I'll add a little bit more because, you know, at this point you kind of get it to your taste the way you like it, a little more salt. One of the things I always add the potatoes last to cook, once I've got the meat where I want it, because if it's a little too salty, potatoes will absorb the salt. And then you can kind of flavor it again, a little bit of salt and pepper if you need to. We're going to let this cool. I find it tastes better after it's set down and it's a little cool. It's a more truer flavor of what you're getting. So now that that's going on in there, I'm going to add the potatoes. Again, this is 4 potatoes. It's about a potato a pound. I added a little extra. Now I cubed them. Again, every recipe is slightly different. Oop, there's an eye. You don't want the eye. Every recipe is slightly different. Just going to let that come up to a boil as well. And taking a few classes is you want to have everything ready when you're going to do something. So little egg wash, it's just 1 egg, probably a teaspoon, tablespoon of water, not too much. That's good, that's going to be for later, in a moment. So while the potatoes are cooking, we're going to check the flavor here in a moment. I'm going to be honest with you, I don't make my own pie crust. I don't have the time. All right? So, I found the best thing out there is Pillsbury pie crust. All right? It's got a little bit of lard in it. It comes out flavorful, flaky, and it's easy. I've tried this. I'm going to add a little more salt. I think it needs it. potatoes are going to absorb some anyways. It also needs a little more flavoring. So I'm just going to guesstimate. We'll throw it in there, we'll try it out. One thing I will tell you about using spices, make sure your spices are relatively fresh. If you've had something in your cabinets for a couple of years, they've lost their pungency. You will have some flavoring, but it's not the same as getting something that's new. And I've ruined many recipes and going, why isn't this more flavorful? I've added so much of this stuff, and that was the reason why. So make sure your spices are relatively new within 6 to 8 months of opening is usually the best way to gauge it for dry spices. I'm going to let that simmer a little bit more. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take pie crust, I'm going to unroll them. Handy dandy, thank you Pillsbury, I tell you, makes life a whole lot easier. And if you have your favorite pie crust recipe, do use it, because sometimes recipes are identifiable with the individual. When I was associate pastor in Franklin, we had a woman, her name was Laura Hebert. Laura had cooked in the rectory at St. Paul's in Franklin for well over 50 years, and she was a very holy woman, but she was a great cook as well, and she had a pie crust that was to die for. It was flaky and buttery, and it just golden brown every time. And so one year for my birthday, she says, Father Marc, she says, what would you like? I said, I'd love one of your apple raisin pies, but I'd also like your pie crust recipe. And she paused, and she says, nobody has that in this town. I said, well, that's all right, but I'll take the apple raisin pie. So that year for my birthday, I get an apple raisin pie with her pie crust recipe on the top. And she simply said, do not use this while I'm alive in this town. And I never did. But shortly after that, several months later, I get transferred to All Saints Parish in Lancaster. And our bishop at the time, Bishop Leo O'Neill, was coming up for confirmation. And I was preparing him dinner. And I had decided I'm going to make an apple pie, and I'm going to use Laura Hebert's pie crust recipe. So Bishop O'Neill had many meals by Laura Hebert when he went to Franklin. And so I made this apple pie, and as he's taking a bite, and he's looking at it suspiciously, and I'm going, I know this is good, but... And then he takes another bite, and he puts his forks down, and he goes, this is Laura Hebert's pie crust recipe. How did you get it? She wouldn't give it to me. And I said, she liked me better. I don't know. What do you check to see where things are at with the meat? So once if I get the flavoring right, we're going to shut the water off, pie off. We're going to drain the excess broth off it, because you don't want to put that in there because it makes it soupy. And then we're going to let the meat cool a little bit before we start putting it in our pies. I kind of flavor as I go along. So I always like to add a little additional allspice, cinnamon and clove if needed. You want to be careful at this stage too, that if you've got it uncovered, you don't want the broth to evaporate completely so that you burn your meat. But I'm going to let that sit for a few minutes, let the flavoring get in there. So now I'm going to sit there and strain the meat off. I mean, not the meat, the broth off, because you don't want to carry that into your pie itself. So I'm just going to sit there. Now you're saying, gee, he's wasting a lot of meat in this broth that's draining out. Normally I would use a strainer to push that down. And then from there, what I would do is use a ladle. Because cooled appropriately, and you don't want it room temperature, but you just want to let some of the steam come out of it, because you don't want it to be soupy dough, because dough can kind of disintegrate if it's too wet. So now we're just going to start filling the pie crust. I'm always generous in my servings, so right now, again, we're going to sit there, we're going to unroll the dough. But before we do that, we have to do a little, take your egg wash, just go around the edge to make sure that the pie crust will adhere. You don't need a lot. You can also use your finger. I'm just using my pastry brush here. When I make pies for my family and friends, I usually make 25 for 30 at a whack. And it's a good way to spend a day in November. What my family, my dad and mom used to do is they used to pre-cook the pie, meaning they cook the pie crust at this point, which is what we'll do also. And that way, when you want one, you just kind of go to the freezer and just warm it up. You don't have to worry about cooking it or anything like that nature. So what I'll do is I'll score them before I freeze them into 8 pieces, and then it's already pre-cooked, and I'll just freeze it, and I'll just take 1 or 2 slices out at a time, as much as I want, and go from there. So now I'm going to crimp the sides with a fork. Okay, I'm going to add some steam holes. Now we're going to put them in the oven. We're going to bake them. Put 2 per shelf in. A little warm there. Okay, and those are going to be about 400 degrees for about 45 minutes to an hour. You want to check it so you don't burn it. And after that time period, you can take it out and you're going to get your beautiful tootsiai, or pork pie, or meat pie, however your family refers to it. Okay, so here we are. We have the finished product. Nice tootsiai.
Oh, it looks delicious.
There we go.
And we get to try it, right?
We get to try it.
Yay.
So we're going to try it. So we're going to tell you, I have to tell you that with the, in doing research, that some of the greatest condiments that they actually serve with it is ketchup, cranberry sauce, or cranberry relish. Some people put a little mustard with it. So, you know, whatever. It's whatever you desire to have to enhance the flavor. I personally, when we were growing up, we never put anything on it, but we always had it with,
thank you so much.
you're welcome, we always had it with sweet pickle mix. Yeah, one of the things that I remember is when we were growing up, we lived above our grandmother on Oak Street. And I lived there the first 6 years of my life, and my grandmother worked for the Belknap Mill. She was one of the, I guess, I'm not sure what to call them. She made socks, whatever. The knitters. She was one of the knitters.
Mill workers.
But she didn't work here in the mill. She worked at her house. Mr. Morin was very creative that in order to expand the workforce, he actually had knitting machines brought into people's homes. And so he would bring the machine into their home, and we were not allowed to go and play in the back room because that was her knitting room. And they'd show up with the truck, and they had these the spools of wool, and then they would have the big barrels, if you will, that she would have her socks in, and they would take them out. Now the thing with my grandmother was she was a very Catholic woman, and she'd be praying, loading with the rosary beads, loading the thing.
The rosary beads?
Right, and I'm going, yeah, OSHA would not like that today. But anyways, you know, it was just one of the things. But I remember that Mr. Morin working, you know, allowing a lot of the people to expand the workforce, but also to give them jobs.
That's wonderful.
You know, so he's just a very kind, generous man,
Yeah.
you know, to allow them to do that. So I always remembered that about the Moore Mill and, you know, part of the good old Canadian heritage here. One thing I didn't tell you, because that was like a generous thing. You know what's interesting about Canadian pork pie? And this is going back into Canada. As I mentioned, you know, it was about meat in the pie. Obviously, it's a meat pie. But not everyone had successful years on the farm. So, as I mentioned, you know, for the Réveillon, they would get together in the village. They go to the closest barn to the church. They celebrate midnight mass, and then they go and they have their Réveillon. Everyone would have their own pork pie. Now, if you had a very good year, perhaps a little wealthy, you might have several types of meat, very little potato.
Oh.
If you did a moderate year, you might have 1 or 2 types of meat with a little more potato. But if you had a bad year, you would have more potato than meat. And you would not ask for help, but people would know where you were at by the type of pie. And after the Christmas and New Year, people would show up and give you maybe animals, chickens, you know, cows, whatever it may be, to help you along to get through the winter months. So the pork pie, in addition to a type of celebrating, became a cry for help without ever asking for it.
It's wonderful.
Isn't that a wonderful
It is
tradition? I found that in a book, and I found that absolutely fascinating.
It is fascinating.
To share that the people, out of the generosity of their heart, without commenting, would just show up and just help their neighbor in
What a
need.
beautiful community. That's what
You know?
it's all about, right?
And so, small village community, right?
Yes. Well, we just want to thank you for joining us here in the kitchen at the Belknap Mill, and thank you, Father Marc. I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm sure everybody else did as well.
Well, thank you for asking me. It's a pleasure to share it with you.
That's great.
Enjoy.
God bless.
You can always buy pork pies at St. Andre Bassette. We actually have a few left from our Christmas fair from last November, frozen, ready to go home. $15 each. Am I a salesman or not? God bless.